They were being rushed toward a town the Germans were already trying to surround. No prepared defenses, no time to rest, and if the roads behind them were cut, thousands of American soldiers could be trapped. The town was Bastogne, and in December 1944, holding it could help decide whether Hitler's final offensive in the West succeeded or collapsed. 3 days earlier, at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the frozen Ardennes had erupted. German artillery hammered American positions across the front. Then infantry and armored formations emerged through fog and dense forest. The attack achieved something few Allied commanders expected so late in the war. Surprise! France had been liberated. Allied armies had reached Germany's frontier. The Third Reich appeared to be dying, but Hitler had gathered forces for one final gamble. His objective was extraordinarily ambitious: break through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse, capture Antwerp, and split the British and American armies. The Germans struck a vulnerable sector. Some American units were inexperienced. Others had been sent there to recover after brutal fighting elsewhere. Then the front began to fracture. Communications failed. Units were separated. Roads filled with soldiers, vehicles and civilians retreating west as German armored columns pushed through openings in the American lines. But those columns depended on roads, and directly in their path stood Bastogne. The Belgian town was a crucial road junction. Multiple routes radiated from it across the Ardennes. Controlling them would make it far easier for German forces to continue west. The Americans understood what was coming. On December 17th, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were ordered toward the breakthrough. The 101st had been recovering in France after fighting in the Netherlands. Now the Screaming Eagles were thrown into another crisis. There would be no parachute drop. They climbed aboard trucks and raced through the freezing night toward Bastogne. Meanwhile, exhausted American forces east of the town were slowing the German advance. Elements of the 28th Infantry Division continued, resisting under tremendous pressure, buying precious time. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division was also ordered toward Bastogne. Now 2 races were unfolding on the same frozen roads. The Germans were trying to reach the crossroads. The Americans were trying to save them. By December 19th, the 101st was entering battle east of Bastogne, alongside armored and other American units. There had been almost no time to prepare. German forces kept advancing around the town. One road was threatened, then another. The Americans had reached Bastogne before it was too late. But the trap was already beginning to close, and soon surrender would be offered as their easiest way out. By December 21st, Bastogne was becoming an island. The roads that had carried American reinforcements into the town were being cut one after another. German forces were closing around the perimeter, and the men sent to hold the crossroads were now fighting with the enemy on nearly every side. There was no safe road out. The 101st Airborne Division was not alone. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, artillerymen, engineers, and survivors of battered formations helped form a rough defensive perimeter. Holding it became harder by the hour. German infantry and armor attacked through villages, forests, and frozen fields. At Noville, American troops faced intense pressure before withdrawing. Foy-Marvy and other positions became part of the struggle for Bastogne's approaches. Every German advance threatened to tighten the ring, and the defenders were fighting more than the enemy. The cold was relentless. Snow and freezing temperatures punished men living in foxholes. Many lacked adequate winter clothing, and frostbite became another threat. Ammunition was precious. Medical supplies were dwindling. The wounded accumulated, and the weather made everything worse. Low clouds and poor visibility prevented effective aerial resupply during the critical early days of the siege. Then on December 22nd, the Germans offered another way out. 4 German soldiers approached, American lines under a white flag, carrying a written demand for surrender. The message warned that the surrounded American force faced destruction. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, was told of the ultimatum. His reaction became one of the most famous responses of the war. Nuts! The word became the official American reply. Defiant, but it did not change the situation. Bastogne was still surrounded. German artillery continued falling around the town. Supplies remained dangerously limited, and the wounded still needed treatment. Then on December 23rd, the clouds finally began to break. Aircraft appeared overhead. American transport aircraft dropped ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Allied fighter bombers could again attack German forces around the battlefield. For men who had spent days beneath a closed winter sky, the aircraft meant something vital. They had not been abandoned. Yet the siege was not over. German attacks continued through Christmas. Some penetrated dangerously close to Bastogne, and the defenders still had to hold a perimeter under enormous pressure. But far to the south, another battle was moving toward them. General George S. Patton's Third Army had turned north with remarkable speed. At its spearhead, American armored forces were fighting toward Bastogne. Inside the perimeter, the defenders had already answered the German demand. They would not surrender. Now they had to stay alive long enough for Patton's tanks to reach them. December 26, 1944. Bastogne had survived the ultimatum, the cold and days of encirclement. South of the town, American tanks were trying to punch through the final. Miles of German resistance before it was too late. The force driving toward them belonged to Patton's Third Army. Patton's army had to shift north, reorganize, and attack the southern flank of the German breakthrough. On December 22nd, the Third Corps began the drive. At its spearhead was the 4th Armored Division. The advance was brutal. Frozen roads, mines, artillery, anti-tank guns. As determined German resistance slowed the Americans village by village. Tanks were lost. Men were killed and wounded. What looked like only a few miles on a map became days of fighting. Inside Bastogne, the pressure had not disappeared. German forces attacked again on December 26th, particularly against the western perimeter. The line held, but relief had still not arrived. Then the battle south of Bastogne accelerated. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, and Lieutenant Colonel George Jacques of the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, decided to drive directly toward the town. At 3:20 p.m., the final thrust began. American armor and infantry smashed through Assenois and continued north. Enemy fire struck the column, and Sherman tanks were knocked out, but the lead vehicles kept moving. At the front was a Sherman later identified as Cobra King. The column raced toward American positions near Bastogne. Then, late that afternoon, they broke through. Men of the 4th Armored Division made contact with defenders of the 101st Airborne. The ring around Bastogne had been broken. For days, the defenders had fought without a secure ground supply route. A ground corridor finally connected the town with American forces outside. Wounded soldiers could begin moving out. Supplies could move in. Relief ended the encirclement, not the battle. But Bastogne was not suddenly safe. The new corridor was narrow and extremely vulnerable. The German forces immediately tried to close it. Fighting around the town continued for weeks as both sides committed more troops to the sector. Yet the strategic situation had changed. The German offensive had already lost precious time. Fuel was becoming critical. Allied air power had returned as the weather improved. Elsewhere, German spearheads were being stopped before reaching the Meuse. Hitler's gamble was running out of momentum. The Battle of the Bulge would continue until January 1945, at enormous cost. But Bastogne had denied the Germans something they desperately needed: speed. The crossroads they had tried to seize became a symbol of resistance instead, and the soldiers ordered into Bastogne, with almost no preparation, had done more than survive a siege. They had helped turn Hitler's last great offensive in the West into a failure.